Our first geographical stop is this tiny, aggressively boring island right off the coast of Maine. A burnt-out 22-year-old booked a suspiciously cheap shoreline cottage to just get away from what he called a colorful past. He just wanted quiet. But, well, that expectation of a relaxing, uneventful retreat violently clashed with the reality of being in a paper-thin cabin actively stalked in the dead of night.
Let's just picture the setup here. He booked this standalone single room right on the shoreline. It's surrounded by thick brush on 3 sides, and the walls were so paper-thin he could literally hear the wind brushing against them. The front window only had this semi-translucent curtain. But strangely, the door featured an unexpectedly heavy deadbolt and chain lock. Kind of a red flag, right? Anyway, he settles in, only to discover his phone charger is completely busted. So his only connection to the mainland is severed just as the last ferry leaves and the island completely empties out for the night.
Waking up completely randomly in the middle of the pitch-black night, he's suddenly paralyzed by a sound. Footsteps on the gravel outside his window. They were deliberate, slow paces crunching right outside those paper-thin walls, eventually stopping directly in front of his locked door. And this right here perfectly captures the sheer terror of his situation. After shining a flashlight through the door and violently banging on the wood to scare whoever it was off, the unseen stalker actually spoke. From the other side of the door, the strange man's voice just says, "I know you're in there, Leo." I mean, that completely shatters any illusion that this was just a random encounter or some curious local passing by. The stalker knew his exact name and exactly where he was staying. So he spends this agonizing night basically crouched behind that door, tracking the sound of the guy circling his tiny cabin for what felt like hours. Finally, as dawn approaches, he hears the engine of the one small blue motorboat he'd noticed at the dock earlier that evening. It starts up and fades across the open water, which pretty much confirms someone had specifically tracked him across the ocean to this incredibly remote location. Okay, let's move to our second location and see how this isolation theme really builds. This time, we're following a structural engineer who is invited to study concrete degradation in Japan's most famous post-industrial ruin, Hashima Island. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, essentially a completely abandoned concrete coal mining facility right off the coast of Nagasaki. Tourists can technically visit, sure, but only on designated paths. Our engineer, though, he was granted special access to the inner ruins. To access this massive, decaying concrete fortress, our narrator was assigned a local escort named Takeshi. Now, Takeshi was pretty indifferent, but gave him this strict, honestly oddly specific list of rules before they even stepped onto the island. Number 1, stay on designated concrete paths. 2, do not enter anything marked with red tape. 3, do not touch anything unnecessarily. And the most crucial one, stay within visual range of Takeshi at all times. While venturing up to the 4th floor of an abandoned residential block, the engineer broke away slightly and followed these disturbed dust tracks down a dark hallway. He stepped into a room, expecting, lifeless ruins. Instead, he found a room radiating an unnatural heat from the concrete walls, accompanied by an unidentifiable smell that wasn't quite human but definitely wasn't animal either. When he reported this to Takeshi, the guide flat out and very nervously denied it could exist, refusing to even look at the room. The tension fully explodes around midday when they enter the taller central residential block. Up on the 5th floor, the engineer finally finds definitive proof of human habitation, a pile of blankets and empty water bottles. And man, within minutes, things spiral completely out of control. He turns around to show his guide, only to realize Takeshi has vanished, and the stairs they literally just came up were now intentionally blocked by a pile of rubble. So our terrified narrator is forced to sprint down this maze of dark corridors, actively being chased by multiple sets of heavy footsteps echoing right behind him. Miraculously navigating the maze of collapsing ruins to find another stairwell, he sprints across the open ground to the dock, and there he finds Takeshi just waiting. What's chilling here is that Takeshi was completely unfazed, just totally indifferent to the engineer's screaming panic about being chased. He flatly refused to acknowledge anything had happened, acting as if nothing was wrong at all, which forced this agonizingly silent, deeply uncomfortable boat ride back to the mainland. So the crucial point that elevates this from just a really scary encounter to a lingering, massive conspiracy is what happens next. The organizing professor who pulled the strings to secure all the permits, a Dr. Yamamoto, he completely vanished after the trip,
Our engineer could literally never get in contact with him again, leaving him to forever wonder if he was actually lured into an elaborate trap on that island. And who exactly is living in those restricted ruins?
For our final story, we're heading to the very heart of the United States. We are exploring North Brother Island, which is an overgrown, entirely abandoned quarantine hospital and rehab center located right in the East River of New York City. It is highly restricted, practically swallowed by nature at this point, and sits just a half-mile off the bustling Bronx.
3 college seniors who are researching a thesis on abandoned spaces executed a thrilling, but let's be honest, highly illegal infiltration. Their plan was bold. They were going to sneak into Baratow Point Park at 2 a.m., launch 3 solo kayaks into the water, and paddle a half-mile in the pitch black to reach the island under the cover of darkness.
Dropping into the narrator's shoes for a second, just try to imagine this environment. You're wandering through a post-apocalyptic landscape where giant trees are literally splitting historic hospital buildings in half. Nature is violently reclaiming civilization, all while you're surrounded by the eerie, total silence of the East River, despite being a stone's throw from the city that never sleeps. Refusing to participate with his friends in graffitiing the historic site, our narrator made the classic horror movie mistake. He wandered off alone down a pitch-black hospital hallway to continue taking mental notes for his thesis. As you'd expect, the further he got from his friends Jansen and Jesse, the more the deeply unsettling reality of his absolute isolation began to set in.
Suddenly, he hears his friend Jesse call his name from the darkness ahead. Confused as to how Jesse could have run past him through that absolute labyrinth of rooms, the narrator calls out, asking where he is. A voice, sounding exactly, unquestionably like Jesse, responded immediately from a nearby room, simply saying, "In here."
Sweeping his flashlight into that pitch-black room, he didn't find his friend. Instead, the beam of light illuminated an impossibly tall figure, easily 6.5 feet tall, standing perfectly motionless and facing the corner of the room. It was absolutely 100% not Jesse. Letting out a massive scream, he breaks into a terrified sprint back to his actual friends, who were, shockingly, entirely accounted for in another part of the complex. The trio desperately drags their kayaks into the water to escape. But as they push off into the river, the distinct sound of an older woman moaning and crying echoed right out of the pitch-black tree line directly behind them. Reporting strictly on the narrator's lived experience here, just look at the impossible reality of these facts. The figure was way too tall to be one of his friends. The entity perfectly mimicked Jesse's voice. It somehow knew the narrator's name to call out to him in the dark. And they were supposedly completely isolated in the East River. The most traumatizing takeaway wasn't just the visual of that tall figure, but the paranormal implication that whatever was hunting them on that island could flawlessly steal his best friend's voice. These 3 encounters really bind together a terrifying theme. Whether it's a very human stalker in Maine, a hidden, aggressive commune living in the ruins of Japan, or some kind of unexplainable mimic in New York, the isolation of an island is a massive double-edged sword. The water doesn't keep the monsters out, it keeps you locked in with them, completely cutting off your avenues of escape. Which leaves us with one final, deeply unsettling question to wrap up this explainer. Think about it. If you paddled out to an abandoned island in the pitch black, totally cut off from the rest of the world, and the darkness started calling your name using your best friend's exact voice, would you ever sleep soundly again?